Super cold this morning, hence the winter apparel, but like don't pay attention to that. Like pay attention to this. Okay, so we're going to be talking about really in some sense, the only questions you ever need to ask in any interview ever. And I just want to show you like briefly like how beneficial this has been for me by showing you that okay, I'm 360 some pages into this book and I've done 250 interviews and I just continue to rely on basically like iterations of the same question. And you can get anybody to open up this way to you. Like anybody will open up and start to tell you their secrets if you follow this stuff. And it's super easy, right? Like, so let's dig in. And some of this is going to be found in the Storytelling You. We talk about it a bit there. In particular, this lesson, the Holy Triumvirate of Questions. But let's go ahead and dig in. So basically, what the thing you should know above all is there are really only three questions to ask. What happened? Why did it happen? How did you feel? Okay, like that's it. What happened? Why did it happen? How did you feel? And so let's cover what happens when you do that. Okay, so what happened covers basically like the plot of any story every single time. And once you get used to interviewing people and you ask, well, what happened next? Pretty soon they're going to start to speak in story. The next question is how did that make you feel? So what happened? How did it make you feel? That how did it make you feel? This covers kind of like the interior aspect of their lives. And so every great story has not only an external plot, but some sort of internal plot line as well. And so how did that make you feel? Now suddenly you're covering the internal dynamics of that character as he or she is experiencing this. All right. Lastly is why did it happen that way? And why did it happen that way? I think that that's more of almost a question that deals with like a spiritual plane in some sense, or like a philosophical theme. And every great story has at the end, not only some sort of external plot that drives it forward, not only some sort of internal change that happens to the character because of the external plot, but it has some sort of spiritual message or philosophical message, some sort of theme that emerges. And in a work of nonfiction, you can get at that by asking, well, why did it happen that way, right? Because eventually, when you ask those sort of why questions, those are triggering ever deeper, ever more central beliefs of somebody. And pretty soon now you're starting to get to like the core of the human condition. And also, I would argue, really like the core understanding of, or rather, a worldview for why we are all here. All right. So again, like to put this in practice, like I did 250 interviews for this book, right? And every single time I went into it with these protagonists, and these protagonists are people who go into Afghanistan, after we left Afghanistan, like they get no support from the U.S. government, and they basically try to save people who were left behind after the United States pulled out. They're doing this as civilians. They're formerly veterans. But every single interview that I went into for these very harrowing missions started with, well, what happened, right? And it could be one particular mission. It could be 1 hour of one mission. What happened first, right? And then it's just, okay, well, what happened next? And then eventually you get to the point where the external plot stuff is like, okay, well, how did that make you feel? Okay, great. And then you ask more and more questions. Now you're starting to develop a sense of like, okay, the plane of this sort of external plot point plane graphed alongside the emotional plane as they move through it. And then eventually there's just going to naturally come a spot where you're asking people, well, why did you feel this way? Or why did it happen that way? The why did it happen that way is speaking to some sort of larger societal context in some way. Or why do you think it happened that way? Now we're getting into somebody's like core beliefs about something. That's the stuff, that's the dance that's going to make all of the interviews you do really pop. And people love this, by the way. Like people just want to be understood above all. And so when you tell them, when you give them the ability to tell their story, a lot of times they're going to end up speaking at length. Like for this book, again, 250 interviews, the vast majority of those are well over an hour because we would just like, and the subjects would sometimes say, "Oh man, I don't have much time today," but we would often blow past the time. I don't think like I'm a remarkable interviewer. It's just that I allowed people to start to tell their stories, and I became genuinely interested in it. And so I just always had that what, how, why framework in mind. What happened? How did that make you feel? Why do you believe it happened that way? Those what, how, why questions, suddenly those are the only ones you ever need for long form reporting. Now, I also said today that I was going to be covering like how this applies to all the writing you're doing. And guess what? It applies the exact same way. Like if you're working on a personal essay, if you're working on a screenplay, if you're working on some sort of short story or novel, you can kind of interrogate the text in the same manner. Okay. Like a lot of times I help a lot of writers with, say, personal essays, right? And they'll say, well, I just don't know where this one should start. And we just go through an exercise of like, well, what happened? And so this is a lot of times what I encourage them to do is just simply like, well, start at the beginning. What happened? Graph all that out. All right. And as you're describing what happened, make sure to pause at certain points and just ask yourself, how did that feel as that was happening to me? Right. And now you can write through that. And then it's like, okay, well, why did that happen that way? And suddenly, like that's getting to either some sort of core belief or some sort of structural or societal context of, or some sort of imposition from from some sort of societal context. In any case, you can interrogate your stories and get a richer story by doing that in personal essays. Same thing applies in any sort of fiction, right? It's like, well, what happened? Okay, well, what could happen next to the character? Okay, well, how would that character feel once that happened? Okay, why would the character feel that way? It's it's the simple sort of questions that allow you to dig ever deeper into story. Frankly, I'm doing the same thing with the book, with this third book as I write it, right? I've asked the what, how, why during the reporting process, but now that I have all that material, the same sort of questions applied. Well, what happened next? Okay, I can go and I can look at it, but it's also like, okay, what's the best way to summarize what happened next? How did that make the protagonist feel? A lot of times I have questions that speak to that, and I'm putting that into the writing. Why did it happen that way? Now we're dealing with either some sort of religious belief, maybe some philosophical understanding, maybe just some sort of societal imposition, whatever it could be. And suddenly the story is progressing that way too, because I'm interrogating the text in the same way that I once interrogated, though that's a harsh word. The word I like to use is frankly like having a conversation with somebody when you're interviewing them. But that's how secrets are revealed, right? That's how other people get you to tell that's how other people let you in on their secrets, and that's how frankly like the stories that you want to tell, like the stories exist within the text itself, and you can unlock those secrets by asking these sorts of questions. All right, I hope that helped. Talk to you next week or whenever I want to do this again. Bye bye.